From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Think of the American Civil War, and certain images come to mind. Blood, death, gore, the ending of slavery, cunning military strategies, colossal military mistakes, the making of heroes, the construction of demons, battles fought, causes lost. Far, far less likely to come to mind when thinking about the Civil War is the work of the English playwright William Shakespeare. And yet that is precisely who today's guest wants us to consider when we examine the American Civil War. As fantastic as the idea sounds, there is every reason to insert the bard into the war. After all, did his plays not retail in blood and cunning, gore, mistakes, tragedy, and heroes? Didn't Henry V and Richard III tell of war and its effects on those who waged it? There is much more to this association than you might first assume. Joining us today to help us understand how Shakespeare figures into the Civil War is Professor Sarah Gardner, Distinguished University Professor of History at Mercer University. She is a prolific author and one of the most respected scholars of the American South working today. Most recently, she has published Reviewing the South, the Literary Marketplace and the Southern Renaissance by Cambridge University Press in 2017, and she's co-edited 3 important books, the latest of which is with Stephen Stowe, titled Insiders and Outsiders, New Directions in the Intellectual History of the American South. Professor Gardner has earned many fellowships and awards, and her work has been sponsored by, among others, the National Endowment for the Humanities. She is currently working on a book project examining reading habits and practices during the Civil War, and that's what she will be chatting with us about today. Sarah, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you. Happy
Good to have you.
It's
Lovely to have you. Okay, this is really interesting as a topic, I have to say. The Civil War, done to death. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that there's anything original left, but you've found something original. What do people say to you? What's their first reaction when you say, yeah, I'm working on Shakespeare in the American Civil War?
Silence.
I'll bet, yeah.
Yeah, not a lot. Maybe that's intriguing.
That's interesting. But they sort of disbelief, right?
Disbelief.
Because they can't, well, why do you think that is?
Because it's not all of those things that you started off by listing, right? So
right.
We think about military tactics and people on the home front, but when we think about people on the home front, we're not necessarily thinking about how they pass their days.
Right. So when you talk about Shakespeare in the Civil War, are you talking about just the home front or also the battlefield itself?
Talking about soldiers in camp.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the home front. I'm talking about print culture,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of print culture, a lot of visual culture. So that can take place, right? I mean, someone on the home front and someone in the military and in camp can be reading the same thing. Yeah, and often they would share material, and mostly this finds itself in letters and in diaries.
Okay, I was going to ask you about the sources, and we'll get to that in a bit. But it's quite useful to remember, isn't it, that we tend to think of the Civil War largely because of reenactors that they're always fighting, but they weren't.
No,
they were. Most of their time was spent in camp, not fighting. Correct.
Correct.
Right. So they're doing stuff. They're reading. Yeah. And this is how you're accessing this question: what are they reading? And one of the things they're reading is Shakespeare, right? Okay.
Overwhelmingly.
Can you tell us something about the sort of literacy levels of soldiers? I mean, is this just officers doing this, or is everybody doing it?
Yeah, I will say this is where I get pushback, mm-hmm. and it's this sense that only officers were reading, and it has something to do with literacy rate, but it also has something to do with familiarity. And Shakespeare was hard.
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare is too hard for the average soldier, which is bupkis.
Ah, right. So Shakespeare was much more accessible to this age.
Correct. In part because students would have learned how to argue by reading Shakespeare's plays, would have learned something about eloquence by reading Shakespeare. Shakespeare was in every edition of McGuffey Readers, the primers, starting with the 4th edition, going all the way through past Reconstruction.
And those McGuffey Readers, for people who don't know, they were largely kind of primers for people who maybe didn't go to school but learned at home.
Yes.
Okay.
They could be read in school, but yes, read at home.
So Shakespeare's in these very basic texts and has a kind of currency that we've tended to elevate Shakespeare to an elite status today, but that's not the case, right?
Right. So if one were to Google something about a particular play, right, and I don't know, Henry V, and you might come up with something. We used to have Spark Notes and all those things, but now you might come up with something that's called No Fear Shakespeare.
Okay.
Right. And the implication by No Fear Shakespeare is like, Shakespeare's scary.
Yeah.
This is going to be hard, but we're going to make it easy for you. That would not have made any sense to the Civil War era generation, because Shakespeare was shared. It was not something to be terrified.
So it was normalized,
It was
right?
normalized.
It's just part of a canon, a part of a set of readings. So when you look through these letters ranging from officers, well, how far do you go down? I mean, what's the lowest rank that's reading?
I have no idea. None, except, none. I'm just going to say none in terms of the camp. I really don't know.
But soldiers are definitely reading
just foot
this.
soldiers, yeah.
Okay.
Right, and many camps had libraries.
Is that right?
Yeah, have a tent. Surgeon was often the librarian.
Okay.
Because they were good at taking records.
Yeah.
Of what was being read and how often, and what was popular and what wasn't popular.
Okay.
But lots of times, soldiers would bring Shakespeare with them.
All right.
They had their own copies.
Okay.
And they were shared. And sometimes they would write home, "Please send me
some Shakespeare."
Some Shakespeare.
As well as some food.
Yeah.
Yeah. Food for the soul. Interesting. And your sources here are what, largely letters? Any official sources that you use? Or, I mean, how do you access this question?
I start with the archive,
and
I start by looking at what soldiers are writing in their letters, and what soldiers and people on the home front are writing in their diaries. Right. And so that's what tells me that I can see a lot of activity, right, with reading Shakespeare. What was the other part of the question? Sorry.
I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you go about accessing this? So you're looking at diaries and letters. Does it ever crop up in like official correspondence?
Not that I've seen, but I don't know that I've looked for it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. This is not answering your question. You might find something, a correspondent who will describe a battle in Shakespearean terms, kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
But I don't know if I found something in official correspondence. But I do have a general who's like had some downtime, so he's going to go see a production of Shakespeare in Kansas City or something like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So as you're doing this research, I mean, my word, it really is original too, because everybody's read these letters. I mean, every serious Civil War scholar has looked at these letters and diaries, and they've gone through the newspapers, and they know this stuff, but their radar just hasn't been attuned to Shakespeare.
Yeah, well, and I would more broadly, not particularly interested, more interested in things like drinking in camp, right? Gambling in camp.
Things you might expect people to do.
Soldiers behaving badly in their downtime.
Yeah.
Right, and that's not always the case. And one has to not necessarily recognize an illusion,
Uh-huh.
but one has to say that sounds like an illusion, right? This little string here doesn't sound like the rest of these letters, so this must have come from something else.
Uh-huh.
So this thing is not original to the soldier or to the wife on the home front. It's something that they're putting in their letters in order to convey something that they wouldn't be able to convey, they think, without this particular passage.
So this is really forensic kind of literary research, isn't it? I mean, you're like looking for sentences and things that suggest. Did you find as you were embarking on this project that you had to refresh yourself with Shakespeare?
Oh, hell yeah. Am I allowed to say that? Yes.
Yes,
I
can.
did. Yes. Because I'm not a scholar of Shakespeare. Right. I'm a scholar of 19th century U.S. history. Did I read a lot of Shakespeare in school? Yes. That was a long time ago. It's not like I retained all of that. And there's certain plays that I hadn't read until I started this project.
So did you like find yourself like going back through everything? Did you really?
Yeah.
How long did that take?
Forever.
I bet.
Yeah, I mean, I gave myself a schedule, and some I read more carefully than others. Some plays pop up more often than others. All right, I could probably name a few that.
Okay, yeah. Tell us what's the most common play that pops up? Is it Hamlet? I'm guessing.
Hamlet.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar.
Okay, of course. Yeah.
Macbeth.
All right. Yeah. Yeah.
King John.
Okay.
And probably something else that I'm not remembering, but I will later.
No, but now you mention them, they sound really obvious. But that's part of the beauty of this project, right? It's the history of the obvious that nobody sees. Okay.
Oh, Othello.
Othello, of course.
Othello is huge.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
That makes perfect sense. What's not common? The problematic plays.
Although some of the plays that we've already mentioned are problematic.
That's true.
Right.
That's true.
So, so far I found only one use of "All's Well That Ends Well."
Okay.
But I found it, and that's one of the problem plays.
How about Measure for Measure? Kind of tragic comedy, tricky.
Yeah, probably somewhere.
Yeah, but not.
But not one of the big five.
Yeah, not one of the big five.
Not one of the big five.
Did you do any kind of counting for this, or is it is it qualitative analysis?
Oh, tallying which ones are. No, but I could easily. I don't know if that really matters much.
Yeah, it probably doesn't. I'm just curious. You know, who's number one, right? Who's in the top hit parade?
Yeah, it's gonna be Hamlet or Othello.
Okay. So it's between, and does it change over time during the war?
Not that I can tell.
Okay, so it's not like they're reading.
No, one of the things this doesn't answer that question, but historians, scholars, when they're writing about war, often take epigraphs from Shakespeare.
Yes.
Right, as a title or a subtitle of it. So we're no less immune to appealing to Shakespeare to describe.
No, I get it. No, we do it all the time.
We
do
it all the time.
Yeah, because it makes us look clever.
Yeah.
Right. But there's actually a real function to that. But historians just don't know they're doing it. Right.
Well, and because it either guides us, right, and gives us a way to think about, and that's how I frame it, right? Shakespeare gives the wartime generation a language and a framework to interpret and to articulate what they're feeling. But in some way, I suppose it can be limiting, right? Because we're in this framework.
So can we break it down a bit further? I don't know if you've done this, and if you haven't, it's fine. I'm just curious. Are Union soldiers more likely to read Othello and Confederates more likely to read Macbeth or something? No? It's pretty evenly spread?
Yeah, we're going to hear. I have a Confederate soldier who loves Othello. He just wished he weren't so dark.
Oh my
I mean, he actually says that in his
interesting.
In his diary. But he thinks it's just sublime. He just loves Othello. And I'm elevating this one person, but he's not the only one who reads Othello.
So during this moment of intense physical sectional conflict, Union and Confederate soldiers have a common reading.
Yes, they do.
How fascinating.
Yes, they do.
What's your takeaway from that? Which is a bit of an unfair question, I know.
it's war is part of the human condition. Shakespeare wrote a lot about war or its attendant consequences.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing particularly Union-ish or leaning toward the Confederate. There's nothing partisan in that sense.
So they couldn't draw on Shakespeare to make a political point for their side. Is that right?
They try.
Okay.
They try, but it doesn't mean that the other side isn't doing precisely the same thing with, if not the same passages, with similar passages.
I'm guessing, I don't know, I'm guessing that it crops up, Shakespeare crops up especially in perhaps speeches from Lincoln and Davis?
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. Lincoln, Davis. This is not Frederick Douglass.
Okay. What does Douglas say about Shakespeare?
What is? Well, he uses Othello when he is when after he sends it was a response from Horace Greeley or something like that when he publishes a letter in Horace Greeley, and he uses Shakespeare.
And are Davis and Lincoln using the same text for different effects?
Davis is using Julius Caesar.
Okay.
And it's a passage in which essentially it's when he's leaving the Senate floor, when he walks out, drop mic, right? And he cites a passage from Julius Caesar that essentially is something to the effect of one of the conspirators, Cassius, talks to Brutus and says, we know back, in our ancestors, right? Brutus would have brooked the eternal devil rather than see I'm paraphrasing, obviously, rather than see a tyrant.
Gotcha.
And
yeah.
And he's so basically what he's saying is that time to act is now.
Right. Call to arms now.
Right now.
And what's Lincoln doing? Who does he?
He was Lincoln. Lincoln likes Macbeth.
Okay. How does he deploy Macbeth?
How does he the bloody hand.
Okay.
The bloody hand.
It's always about hands with the Lincoln, isn't it? It's always about hands.
The shaky hand.
The shaky hand.
The bloody hand.
That's right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So do the soldiers ever try to perform these plays in camp?
Yes, although I know less about that than I do about how it appears in diaries and letters and in print. So something that I can continue to work at. I mean, the famous example is from the U.S. war with Mexico and Grant and Longstreet, right? Is it Grant? Anyway, performing Shakespeare. But I can lecturers came and gave talks about.
Is that right?
Yeah, and in one case, a Shakespeare scholar as well as a chaplain was the chaplain of a particular regiment in the Civil War, and he made little tickets and gave lectures about Shakespeare in camp, and you could invite guests to come.
How interesting!
And they had to muster out. They had to go fight, and they didn't get to the last
act,
which was the last play that he was to talk about, which was Hamlet. So
oh my God,
we got to go fight.
How apt! Oh my goodness. Let's just. I mean, I don't know if you even looked at this, but I'm just curious. Who else, in addition to Shakespeare, was read? Like, what are the big names?
Dickens. I mean, it's mostly British fiction.
Right. Well, as it would be, probably.
Bulwer Lytton.
Okay.
Dickens.
Dickens.
Do not get between anyone and their Dickens. Like they're like, all right, love Dickens.
Right? Huh.
The Brontes.
Okay.
Not Austen.
Right.
Not Austen, but the Brontes. Okay. So anything in that tradition. Some popular fiction that was produced during the Civil War era, and that would be partisan. So Cujo's Cave or Mom Guinea or anything, Clotel and all of its afterlives. Mm-hmm. Those were popular as well. And in fact, the last edition of Clotel is one for soldiers in camp. It's a camp edition.
Camp edition.
Yeah.
Right.
Mostly it's that.
How was a camp edition different? Like sturdier or something? Or?
No, it's the opposite. It's more like a pamphlet.
Okay.
So portable.
Yep, portable, right.
And lightweight, which I guess is implied by
sense.
Portable, but
yes.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
And probably disposable at some point.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely disposable. It would be like, reading.
Sarah, I mean, as I'm listening to you, I mean, it's a kind of obvious point, but a really important one, that reading culture was central to the experience of soldiering in the Civil War, right?
You had to read a military manual.
That's right. I mean, but it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just on signs, but I mean, they're walking with these things. They're performing these things. They're listening to lecturers talk about these things. They're reading them in the privacy of their tents.
One of the things that surprised me at the time, a soldier who is reading the Atlantic Monthly.
Okay.
And it's 1864, and it's the one that has Holmes talking about the don't make me say it, the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. So it's all about Shakespeare. And he writes home and says he's read this admirable article in the Atlantic Monthly, and he says, I'll send it home to you. So you have a soldier sending it home, and sending the Atlantic Monthly back home because he's worried they won't have it on the home front, which is nutty, because typically you think of people on the home front sending material to people in camp, to soldiers in camp, rather than a soldier in camp saying, here, I read this great thing, I'll pass it along to you. So there is that kind of shared thing, and then that you and I have read the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that is important.
A part of that imagined community.
Lots of times when attempts that almost always fail. Let's start reading this book on Thursday, you and I.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Right. And we'll read a chapter every day so that we can be reading the same thing at the same time. So that we can be in sync.
And probably more important than ever to do that, right? Given the kind of dislocation of war, the atemporality of it, they're trying to establish some kind of normalcy.
Yeah, it's supposed to. How can we make this thing, which is as far away from home as it possibly could be, and how can we make it seem more like home?
Interesting. So, would you consider this to be a pretty significant revisionist intervention into our understanding of the Civil War, this reading culture and soldiering and war?
I hope so, mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I think part of what people are doing are finding ways to combat those demotivational emotions, like the ones that make you slothful or drink too much. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we can cope.
Yeah.
And reading is one of them.
And reading is also, I mean, it has legs, right? So gambling you can do until you run out of money. Drinking, you can't do that. I mean, you can do it for a few hours, but risky.
At some point,
risky because you might be called to the battlefield. But reading is something that has it sort of threads its way through all of those activities, doesn't it? Or at least occupies a bigger space.
Yeah. And one of the things I should make clear that it's, if I haven't already, just because you read doesn't mean you don't drink and gamble. Right. This is not here are the virtuous good people
right.
And here's everyone else. Everyone is, to some degree participating in any of these. Right, any of these kinds of
So in a
cultures.
way, I mean, Civil War historiography has been moving away from the battlefield into the experience of soldiering and war for a little while now. And we have lots of good books on that kind of thing. But is this really tell me if I'm wrong, but I know there's been some work on reading during the Civil War, but it's not been sustained and it's not been at this level. Is that correct? I'm not asking you to say that you're the best thing since sliced bread,
Yes.
Sarah, but there is something you're doing that's really important here.
I think so.
Uh-huh.
I think so. I mean, articles,
Yeah.
right? Book chapters, those kinds of things. I am beholden to the works of people who've gone before me. All right. But think that this is, if not a new take, something akin to being new.
Yeah, and sustained, right? This will probably be the first
Right.
book-length, treatment of this topic, right?
And yes, and something that's broader than Emily Dickinson in Shakespeare,
Right.
or Melville in Shakespeare,
Right.
or Holmes in Shakespeare.
So I know you're still working on this, and you'll probably be working on it for a little while because it's detailed and it's hard and it's difficult. In that bigger project, do you anticipate sort of going into the immediate post-war years to see what happens to reading habits, if anything?
Yeah, I do. And I don't, interest in Shakespeare, interest in reading doesn't stop because the war has ended.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, again, these are what they're trying, at least if I'm talking about the people in camp, what they're trying to do is recreate what they would have been doing at home. And so if you were reading at home, I mean, readers are readers. Right.
Yeah.
And so if you were a reader at home and you're a reader in camp, there's no reason like, oh, look, it's 1871. I'm finished reading now.
Right.
So they will continue to read. Now, the question about that is whether they record that reading like they did in this period, right? Because there's a reason to keep diaries, and there's a reason you're writing home to your family, because you're not with them. Right. And so I have to see what's out there.
And conceivably, you probably have more time during the war because you have to be in
there's
a place where there's a lot of downtime.
A lot of downtime.
So you can have the opportunity to record these things, right? Yeah. So I like this a lot because it reminds us that this distinction between home front and war front is kind of artificial. I mean, they're bringing the home to the battlefield. It just doesn't make for a tidy distinction, right? That's really what I'm hearing here, I think. Among other things.
I think so. They're trying to recreate that which was familiar.
There's a lot going on in this book, obviously, and I know you're working on it and you'll continue to work on it. But if, and it might be premature, so you don't have to answer if you don't have one, what would be the big takeaway that you would want your readers to leave with after pondering Shakespeare and the Civil War? And if there isn't one, that's fine. But there might be more than one.
I'll just hold on to that for a little while.
Okay. All right. Sarah Gardner, Distinguished Professor of History at Mercer University, thank you for being on Take on the South. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Gardner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.